Hi, Kairazga here again. Welcome back to the weekly wrap-up brought to you by Tech Law Decoded. This week, I'm going to take a break from the regular format and dig in on this week's big tech hearings before the US House of Representatives Judiciary Committee. On a quick glance, the hearings could seem chaotic. There was rapid-fire questioning in 5-minute bursts. Witnesses were barely given a chance to respond to many of the questions. And there was a fair share of political grandstanding, most but not all relevant to antitrust. But a careful look is actually worth the effort. It reveals some deep insights into US lawmakers' views on the future of regulating the tech industry. And it's an especially important development in the US, which has been slow in thinking about these issues compared to some other jurisdictions around the world. Just a reminder, this is not legal advice, and the views expressed are my own. So, what were the big tech hearings all about? The Antitrust Subcommittee has, for about a year now, been conducting an investigation into big tech. The legal framework for that investigation was revealed through the hearings, and it seems to focus on two main areas. First, whether prior acquisitions by tech companies were used to protect or create dominant positions. And two, whether tech companies have abused their market power in the treatment of their business partners. So in the process, it seems like there are two main questions being asked. One, have the tech giants violated the antitrust laws? And two, is there a need to update the antitrust laws or take other legislative action to restore competition in the digital economy? The questioning revealed a large factual record that the committee has already developed from documents, interviews with business people. And now, from the hearing, they also have the sworn testimony from the CEOs of 4 major tech companies: Google, Amazon, Apple, and Facebook. Although ostensibly a fact-gathering hearing, in reality, it felt a little bit more of like a megaphone for congressmen and congresswomen. At some times, it felt like the CEOs were sort of props in order to send a message. But the message is valuable in following nonetheless. And the message was the following. One, big tech has gotten too big and it controls critical infrastructure online. Two, it has used that large size to cut off competition and exploit smaller businesses dependent on that infrastructure. And three, that drastic remedies are perhaps necessary. So that's sort of the way that the committee framed the issues according to their questions. And in the process, the hearing revealed quite a bit into the thinking from Congress about what the problems are and what the solutions might be. It's also worth mentioning that the hearing fulfills sort of an important democratic function. This is one of the only times some of these CEOs will be required to answer these questions. Though personally, I wish they had had more opportunity to speak as they were cut off very often. So what did the hearing reveal about the antitrust theories and underlying facts that the committee's been looking into? Notably, very little in the way of consumer harm, although the CEOs tried their best to steer the conversation to the topic of consumers and how consumers have benefited from the products and services offered by them. The examiners seemed less interested in that sort of line of inquiry under what antitrusters will call a consumer welfare standard. And they seemed more focused on some notions of competition policy that Europeans might find more familiar, including Brandeis was cited in some of the questioning. And so the hearing focused on two main areas. One, the exclusion of competitors, which is a more familiar topic for antitrusters. But two, even more so, the hearing focused on the unfair treatment or exploitation of small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs, which depend on the big tech platforms. So let's start with the exclusion of competitors. Here, the issue is framed as sort of the existence of a big tech kill zone, which is questions of how tech companies are able to threaten existing or potential rivals. So one of those areas involves eliminating competition with exclusionary or predatory practices. So here, the questioning towards Facebook looked at its practices of blocking competing services from using its platform or from accessing its tools. So one specific example given was with Pinterest. With Amazon, the questioning targeted predatory pricing, including an example with diapers.com, which Amazon eventually acquired following an aggressive below-cost pricing campaign, according to the questioning at least. And with Apple, there were questions concerning the tying or bundling of the App Pay function to the App Store, mainly through the mandatory use of App Pay for monetizing apps. The other area for questioning in the exclusion of competitors had to do with killer acquisitions, which are acquisitions used to eliminate potential rivals. Here, Facebook faced a majority of the questioning with respect to its prior acquisitions, which were alleged by the examiners as preventing competitors from getting a foothold in social media markets. So one example that was used was the Instagram acquisition, and there was evidence rolled out, including emails that talked about whether Facebook threatened to go into quote destroy mode against Instagram if Instagram didn't sell, meaning Facebook threatened to copy or displace on Instagram and thereby try to force it to sell it. With Google, the questioning centered around YouTube, the acquisition of YouTube, and whether that was also a deal that was motivated by wanting to eliminate a potential rival. But by far the larger focus of the hearing was the unfair or exploitative treatment of small businesses that rely on the big tech platforms. Here, the big question was, are these smaller businesses treated as competitors or are they treated as partners of the platforms? Four main categories were covered. One, the use of the exploitation of information from third parties to compete against them. This was referred to as the surveillance of competitors by the platforms. And so that refers to the platform's use of data about third-party vendors in order to, for example, copy the products or to displace them in the marketplace. So with Amazon, the questioning centered on the use of seller data gathered through its marketplace. Also, the questioning focused on Amazon's cloud computing service, AWS, as well as Amazon's own internal venture fund, and whether information and data gathered through those sources was used by Amazon to launch its own private label products. With Apple, the questioning focused on its use of data from third-party apps that use the App Store. Again, whether that data was used to develop competing native apps of its own. And with Google, a similar line of questioning focused on the Android Play Store. The second category of the unfair or exploitative practices had to do with self-preferencing. That is, the self-preferencing by the tech companies of their own products over those sold by third parties on their platforms. So with Amazon, the questioning there dealt with whether there was better placement for Amazon's own private label products on its marketplace, or in its recommendations made by its Alexa smart home product. With Apple, the questioning focused on whether the company had dropped apps from the App Store, which were competing with Apple's own native apps. And with Google, the questioning focused on the use of its search engine and whether that was used to steer users to Google's own products and services, where Google could earn more of revenue from advertising than it could from third-party services that use Google for advertising. Third category involved sort of the fairness of dealings with small businesses. With Amazon, that questioning focused on the fees that Amazon charges to third-party sellers for certain ancillary services that Amazon offers them, like logistics services, for example. With Apple, the questioning focused on the fairness of its 30% commission charge to App Store to apps that run in the App Store. And with Google, the questioning focused on whether it was unfairly using the content of third-party publishers and then monetizing it with advertising. And then the last category in the fairness/exploitation line of questioning had to do with whether tech companies had conflicts of interest that result sort of inherently from the structure of their businesses. With Amazon, that had to do with its dual role as a seller of private label products, as well as an operator of a marketplace for third-party sellers. There, the questioning asked whether Amazon was, quote, fundamentally anti-competitive in the way that it's set up. With Facebook, the questioning here focused on its advertising-based model and whether that created inherent incentives to allow incendiary or harmful content on the platform, which would attract more attention. And finally, with Google, the questioning focused on whether there was a conflict of interest in it acting as a broker on both the buy and sell side of the online advertising space. So that's a quick run through of sort of the main topics that were covered. What to expect next? Well, a report will follow, which will set out the facts gathered in the investigation and make recommendations. The 2020 elections in the US are certain to have a major impact on what happens next. It was clear from the hearing that many of the Republicans involved were less concerned about traditional antitrust concerns and seemed to have less desire to revise the antitrust laws. And then in terms of what happens next, a lot of behind-the-scenes lobbying is certain to follow and impact how this plays out. My take was it was a bit of a shame to see the four companies lumped together because they are very different businesses and each raise different regulatory questions. To call them all cyber barons, one and the same, without accounting for those differences is inaccurate and probably misleading as well. But much of that is political grandstanding, and I would expect the process to play out in a way that will treat these companies somewhat differently. And so would expect some of these companies to face some structural risk. It's tough to see that resulting in the breaking up of companies, despite that used as a frequent rhetoric. But it's easy to imagine some sort of rules or regulations imposing firewalls that try to deal with some of the conflicts of interest that were identified in the questioning. So that could involve, for example, Google's ad business or Amazon's marketplace, and whether separation can be done between different parts of the business to prevent information from crossing over and influencing decisions that influence or that impact third-party sellers and vendors. Could also see some regulation of fair and equal treatment of small businesses on these platforms coming out of this process. Again, that could involve the Amazon marketplace. That could also impact the app stores for Google and Apple. As for Facebook, it seems to be on a path that might include some content control regulations, or at least some potentially expanded liability for the content that appears on its platform. Its antitrust risks, however, seem more tied to its past acquisitions, which is a matter that Congress very well might leave to the competition authorities to sort out. As we know, FTC is already has an ongoing investigation of Facebook, which is understood to be looking into past deals. And some or all of this may be headed off by proactive steps that might be taken by these tech companies. For example, some of the questioning signaled that if tech companies were to change the rules or the policies that they have governing their dealings with third-party sellers and vendors in order to make those dealings more fair in the eyes of the congresspersons that were asking the questions, that might head off the need for legislative action in some of these areas. But needless to say, it was a big moment for big tech, and there's more surely to follow. And I'll try to cover it when it comes. So, with apologies for a slightly longer episode this week, thanks for joining. That's it for this week. For more on the latest developments in the worldwide efforts to regulate the digital revolution, check out techlawdecoded.com or follow me on Twitter @Kairoska. Until next week, take care.